I'm Bob Whitaker. Welcome to History Respawned. On today's show, we'll be discussing two role-playing games heavily inspired by medieval European history, Dragon Age Inquisition and The Witcher 3. Our guest historian is Professor Matthew Gabriele from Virginia Tech. Matthew is an expert on the intersection between religion and violence in the Middle Ages, and has written extensively on topics including Charlemagne and the First Crusade. All right, welcome to the episode. Matthew, thank you for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Happy to do it.
So, both Dragon Age and The Witcher take place in fantasy worlds that are heavily informed by medieval history. We also have medieval influence popping up in film and television through things like The Hobbit and Game of Thrones. What do you think is behind this interest in medievalism and medieval settings?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I've thought about quite a bit because, in my kind of teaching life, that medievalism, that popular culture of the Middle Ages is a lot of what attracts students into classes. And so, I have to deal with those preconceptions all the time. And, at least in my thinking, it doesn't seem like it's something new. I mean, people have been fascinated with the Middle Ages ever since the Middle Ages themselves. People have been talking about kind of what it means to be, in between two things,
Sure.
and what that means to occupy a space that is defined by its negation, by being the opposite of something. And at least to my mind, I think that's actually what holds its appeal, is that it becomes this kind of blank space against which you can define your own time. What I mean by that is that it's a place in which you can kind of let your imagination run free, and it becomes a natural backdrop for fantasy elements, because it seems like it's so different from what we have in this world of ours today, whether that be the 19th century, the 20th, or the 21st, or sometime even before then.
Do you think that the kind of relative lack of documentary evidence for the Middle Ages plays into the freedom with which people feel that they can put in fantasy elements?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And because it's even when you have documentary evidence, it's in a foreign language, and it's a language that's widely recognized as dead. When we're talking about Europe, for example, we're talking about Latin, which isn't a spoken language anymore. Although you obviously see roots that continue into the modern Romance languages. It looks like a space that's just fundamentally different than what we have today. And when you combine that with the popular preconception, and not a terribly wrong preconception about the Middle Ages, that it was a time of religion, which most people take to be kind of a superstitious form of religion, a form of religion that isn't kind of fundamentally modern, that has fallen from kind of a pure ancient version when religion or Christianity and Judaism really is what we're talking about, or I guess Islam to a degree as well. It's not that, and it's not the modern return to that ancient purity. It's this kind of period of corruption. So you have superstition and a lack of evidence, and the evidence you have in a language that has long been considered dead. It becomes, again, this canvas in which you can kind of paint whatever you want. That people believed, of course, in that period, that there would be dragons, that there would be monsters lurking out there. And so there's a natural tendency to associate that period with things like Dragon Age, things like The Witcher, which have these fantasy elements kind of ingrained within them.
So both of these games, particularly The Witcher, take place in realms that are seen as brutal and cutthroat, and filled with a lot of betrayals, violence, and a heavy amount of gore. So were the Middle Ages really this violent? And was it common for people to get medieval on each other's asses?
Well, I mean, I think the short answer is yes and no. The period itself is as complex as any other historical period, and what I mean by that is that we're not in our own day, in 21st century America, or even the 21st century West generally, or really the 21st century world. I mean, we have periods of horrendous violence, and we have periods of almost unimaginable peace, that spread out from various kind of focal points. What's interesting to me is that there's really this perception of the Middle Ages really mirrors the kind of scholarly trends. And what I mean by that is that throughout, at least through the 20th century, and probably even before then, is that there were two kind of competing ways of trying to describe the Middle Ages to audiences. And one is to familiarize the Middle Ages, to basically make the Middle Ages seem like today. And the other is to defamiliarize it, is to make it seem unlike anything that happens today. And what I think is going on with this recent resurgence in kind of this fantasy genre, especially in video games, and making them kind of violent, is there is a current kind of trend to defamiliarize, that's kind of overtaking the scholarship. And they're trying to place the Middle Ages as a counterpoint to what we see as an unprecedented period of prosperity and peace. I'm thinking particularly of Steven Pinker's book, which came out relatively recently, which talked about kind of an overall decline in violence. There's a lot of problems kind of with the history behind Pinker's book, but it does kind of represent a kind of more general thought about, we live in a relatively peaceful time in which there aren't large-scale wars going on, and the types of violence that are being perpetrated are, at least in the modern world, are very different than what we imagine to have happened in the Middle Ages. Even the idea of modern warfare being conducted by drone or by computer, in which the idea of a hand-to-hand combat, which is the current of the Middle Ages, is almost unthinkable. When you stab someone with the sword, you have to be right next to them. That's not what it is today. There's a lot of literature, of course, and a lot of popular understanding that, the drones that fly over Afghanistan or over Iraq or over, Syria or wherever are operated out of Texas or out of Washington, D.C. or something like that, and everything is done via video screens. So I think that what's happening with that violence is just, there is a reality to that, in the Middle Ages, and is kind of, portrayed in these medieval themed fantasy epics, that when you killed somebody or when violence occurred, it was a bloody mess, in a way that it's very difficult to imagine today. One of the few things that I liked, for example, about the movie Braveheart as a medieval historian, was that they got the battles kind of right. They were chaotic, they were loud, they were messy, and they were just almost incredibly brutal. It could go on for very long periods of time.
All right. Well, there's definitely a lot of big battle sequences like that, particularly in Dragon Age. And, it seems interesting to me that so much of the violence that's done in both of these games are done to fantasy characters, and rather than actual people. And I wonder if there's something going on there where we're okay to have a lot of gore and violence as long as it's happening to some otherworldly character, rather than a real person, or somebody that maybe would fit into the real world.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that at least in the Dragon Age games, which I've actually played, and so know a little bit more about, I still think that you're meant to feel sympathy for the good guys because they look like us.
Yes.
The bad guys always look different. They're misshapen. They're still kind of monstrous. And so it's easy to dissociate yourself as a player from those people, that they deserve the violence because they're scary and they're threatening. Although elves have pointy ears, for example, or dwarves are short, they still look fundamentally kind of human, as opposed to in the Dragon Age games, the main bad guy, he has like these rocks kind of growing out of him.
Yes.
And the same thing with his army, is that they just look weird. They're different, and therefore it allows you to kind of perpetrate the kind of violence, which really is, if you think about it, I mean, the number of people you end up killing at the end of Dragon Age Inquisition is pretty staggering.
Oh, and of course, and in all of the Dragon Ages, as far as I remember, even going back to the first one, there were achievements tied to killing so many Darkspawn in all of the games. So you were actually rewarded for perpetrating this basically mass murder against what amounts to non-humanoid beings, something that you can kill without necessarily feeling the shame about.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no way to complete the game without actually doing it.
Yeah. All right, well, turning now to religion, and this issue of religion, it plays a major role in Dragon Age. So your character is seen as a divinely appointed inquisitor. There is a religious order of knights called the Templars. There is a major official religion ruled by the Chantry. There are also multiple other religions, including what amounts to paganism practiced by elves. And then the Qunari have a religion called the Qun, which seems pretty closely related to early Islam. So how important was religion in medieval life? And were there as many different types of belief as we see in the Dragon Age series?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of, to me, I mean, I am a medieval historian, but I'm also primarily a historian of kind of religious and intellectual history. I mean, that's one of the most interesting things about the Dragon Age series, for example, is what they do with religion. And to my mind, I think they get religion really kind of right for the Middle Ages. And what I mean by that is that, the things that distinguish the races, the elves versus dwarves versus the Qunari versus humans, for example, is that it's not just that each practices a different religion. It's that a religion is kind of tied to an identity as a racial category. So the elves have X, the Qunari have Y, the humans have Z, and so those boundaries between how people are differentiated, how the characters are differentiated. What makes a human versus what makes an elf versus what makes a Qunari,
right?
Is both religious, but it's also racial. And I think that's really kind of accurate for what's going on in the Middle Ages, at least for the vast majority of the Middle Ages. And what I mean by that is that if you were living in Western Europe and you self-identified as a Christian, that identity would kind of trump almost everything else. So, that allowed, for example, kind of great movements of peoples, like things like the Crusades, for example, is that you had all these disparate peoples from disparate places, many of whom couldn't speak the same language or had never even traveled outside their village in their entire lives. And yet when Christianity was, quote unquote, threatened, at least as it was portrayed by the popes at the time,
right.
They marched off under the banner. That call made sense to them. When there were the horrible attacks on the Jews by the Christian populations of Europe during much of the Middle Ages, is that identity trumped anything else. Is that you were a Jew first, and then you were a citizen of Mainz,
right.
or a Frank or something like that, secondary. And the only way that you could cross boundaries in the Middle Ages was by converting. So if, for example, during the attacks on the Jews during the First Crusade, which accompanied the First Crusade, the Crusaders gave the Jews of the Rhineland a choice. They could convert or they could be killed. And those that converted were spared. They were just kind of accepted into the Christian community because they had renounced that part of their identity. This becomes increasingly problematic later on in the Middle Ages when that process of conversion becomes kind of fully wrapped up in a racial identity. And so just as you can't kind of, at least in a medieval mindset, kind of cast off your race or your origins, there was a question about whether you could cast off your religious identity. And so Jews, for example, in Spain in the later Middle Ages would convert, but then their families would be suspect for several generations because the Christian authorities would always wonder, was this conversion sincere? In the same way that, in the Dragon Age series, I mean, with the Qun, it seems like there's a little more kind of porous boundaries, is that people who are elves or humans could become part of the Qun. But, could a human, a human couldn't become an elf, in the Dragon Age series. And an elf can never become kind of a human, even if, as is some of the cases, there are elves who worship, who follow the Chantry, and then there seem to be some humans who are kind of ambivalent about the elven gods, but they can never really kind of move between those spaces because of their physical characteristics which separate them.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up religion and race. I mean, both of these games have been criticized for their portrayal of race, in particular The Witcher, which is set in kind of this Eastern European milieu, but it doesn't feature any people of color. I think it's an interesting point you bring up that many times these religious divides were based on race, and they were recognized as barriers even at the time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there's some wonderful work being done, both scholarly and I don't want to say non-scholarly, but more popularizing. There's a Tumblr, for example, called Medieval People of Color, and there's a Twitter handle as well. Just doing really great work to show that although that's a popular conception, and in certain specific instances it is true that everybody in certain areas would be white, for example, is that the Middle Ages were no stranger to racial difference, and they thought about those differences in very interesting ways in specific contexts, whether it be literary or historical or something like that. We like to think of Europe as this kind of hermetically sealed area during the Middle Ages, that nobody traveled anywhere, but that's really not the case. I mean, even not just in Spain, in which you had a great mixing of different peoples from all over the place, but also across the Mediterranean world, people were moving, and that's true through the whole of the Middle Ages. And so they encountered people who looked very, very different than themselves, and they had to think about what that meant, that these people were different than they were.
Right. And it's no secret, or at least it shouldn't be a secret to people watching this episode, that people in the medieval world were very well aware of the world outside of Europe, and a lot of the knowledge of the outside world fed into the myths from the Middle Ages. I can think in particular of the myth of Prester John.
Sure.
And how that kind of brings in this idea of pan-Eurasian Christendom. And of course, Prester John never ended up showing up in the Crusades, but it didn't stop people from kind of holding these ideas that there was a wider world.
No, absolutely, and it didn't stop him from looking either. I mean, one of the avowed intentions of Columbus was to find a passage to the Indies so he could look for Prester John. I think people forget about that. He was very invested. One of the reasons he could not be convinced that he hadn't discovered the Indies is because he was still looking for Prester John.
We're still waiting for Prester John.
Still waiting. Yep. The other thing I kind of wanted to mention is that it's interesting that connection between race and religion becomes even more interesting when you compare it to, for example, the Dragon Age series in the later Middle Ages, because then you have this kind of inward turn, and this split in the Dragon Age Inquisition that occurs within the Chantry, between kind of the Chantry itself and the Inquisition, is very interesting, because in the later Middle Ages, Christianity starts to kind of eat itself, at least in Western Europe. And what I mean by that is that you have the creation of this group called the Inquisition in the Middle Ages itself, which is looking for people who are deviating from the norm. And they may seem like good Christians, they may look like good Christians, again, kind of bringing that racial element back into it too, but they're not believing the right things, that they're kind of traitors in or kind of like a fifth column, within the body of Christendom that's trying to pollute it, and that there's these external forces, these secret, hidden external forces that are trying to destroy Christendom from within. And in some ways, that mimics, the main story of the third of the Dragon Age Inquisition, because you have this external force which is trying to pollute, all of Thedas from within by using its kind of agents spread across the world to evince this great, or to set in motion this grand master plan to destroy the world, and the Inquisition is set to stop it. That's kinda what the Inquisition was afraid was happening in medieval Christendom in the 13th and 14th centuries, in which crusades are launched internally against people called heretics, people who were thought to deviate from standard orthodoxy, because heretics, Jews, and Muslims in the 13th and 14th century are thought to be kind of in league together, that they're all working in concert at the behest of the devil to destroy good Christian souls. And the Inquisition is what's created to kind of root that out. Now, the way that's gone about, or the way that went about, I should say, in the real Middle Ages as opposed to in the game, are very, very different things. It's clear in the game the Inquisition is a force for kind of good, because there actually is this conspiracy. But in the Middle Ages, it becomes a lot more problematic, and you get some pretty terrible stuff that happens in the name of doing what they thought was the right thing.
Right. Yeah, and I think Dragon Age is so interesting because it does have a role for persecuted communities, particularly the Elves, who, if they're located in a city, are typically seen as a sub-race that are placed into ghettos. And like you're saying, with the Middle Ages, that was a very common type of reality, especially for Jews throughout Christendom.
Yeah, and Dragon Age is very smart about how it plays with all these things. Like you mentioned kind of a little while ago, the Qun is kind of, in some ways, kind of a version of early Islam. The Elves could be seen as perhaps the Jews who live within medieval Christendom, but there are also, a lot of them have Irish accents in their voice actors. So that's another kind of weird commentary.
Interesting. Yeah, I had never noticed that. That's a good point.
And then the humans are either English if they're Ferelden, or they're French if they're Orlesian.
Yes.
And then Antiva is kind of like Venice, or Italy kind of, and then I don't really know what they're doing with Tevinter. They're kind of like these other people. Maybe we'll find out in the next game.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna get a good sense that Tevinter might be the setting for next Dragon Age. I think they've played out Ferelden and definitely Orlais at this point. So we'll see. Hopefully. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is the setup of the main religious forces in Dragon Age. In particular, you've got the Chantry, kind of seen as the established church, and then you have the Templars, who are the ones who defend the faith, and then there's a group of mages, kind of, some of them are freelance, some of them are tied to the Chantry, but this seems to kind of, mimic the makeup of medieval society, right? You have at least, from my early days of taking medieval history classes, you have the people who pray, you have the people who fight, and then you have the people who work. So, could you talk a little bit about that? What do you think of this religious hierarchy that we see in Dragon Age?
Yeah, I might read it a little bit differently, and what I mean by that is that, I think the mages have to be there because it's a fantasy game. Mm-hmm. You just need that element. Ever since Tolkien, Tolkien and Lewis kind of defined what fits within kind of a modern fantasy genre. You just need a magic user. You need somebody who can cast spells. But that religious hierarchy, I think, is at least as it relates to the Chantry and the Templars. Mm-hmm. I think is really interesting too, because what you see in the third Dragon Age game is this revolt of the Templars against the Chantry,
yes,
which I think was a great fear of the late medieval church, or late medieval kind of Christian or Western Christianity, right before the Templars were forcibly disbanded in the 14th century.
Right,
is that the Templars became a force unto themselves, and they really could have had the authority if they wanted to around 1300 to kind of strike out on their own and do something that maybe not everybody would be particularly happy about. In the Dragon Age game, start or continue depending on your perspective, I guess. This great war that's kind of ripping the continent apart. So, but the fact that Dragon Age is very concerned about religious hierarchy, I think is also another very smart move on their part, at least as it relates to kind of the history of the Middle Ages, because that's a really important question throughout the period that I study is, who's in charge of who, and what are their kind of spheres of influence, and what's a proper role for a Templar as opposed to a priest, as opposed to a monk, as opposed to an abbot or a bishop or a pope or whatever. And then there are those, as you mentioned, kind of in the classic distinction, those who work, who are always at the bottom, and those are the guys who get caught up in the war. They're just trying to have a farm and feed their kids and things like that, and there are these forces above them that kind of rampage through and sometimes disrupt that in really kind of terrible ways.
So in the Dragon Age series, there's a really close relationship between the real world and the spiritual world, or spiritual realm. And the divide between these two is often penetrated by spiritual possession or by recurrence of the kind of hellspawn coming up from the ground, what they call in the game the Blight. And does this permeability of the divide between the real and the spiritual worlds found in Dragon Age reflect medieval thought?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it reflects modern thought, too, in some ways. I mean, I was looking at something recently which said that 42% of Americans, as of 2013, still believed in ghosts. I mean, that's the permeability of the real and the spiritual. But I think in the Middle Ages as well, the fact that, and I'll give us a spoiler here, so, if you're listening, you might want to cover your ears, that Solus is revealed to be the Dread Wolf, one of the elven gods at the end. I mean, that would, not that it would be, one of many gods showing up on Earth, but the idea that the divine would take an active interest in the events of the world and would participate in those events would be perfectly at home in a medieval mindset. That God had created this world, at least from a Western Christian perspective, God had created this world and still took an active interest in it, and would still intervene. He would show his happiness or his displeasure by the course of events. When the Crusades were successful, for example, that was God showing his favor. And when the Crusades were unsuccessful, it was God, from a Western Christian perspective, punishing Christians for their sins, showing his displeasure and the need to get back on the right track. That veil, if you will, between the divine and the human was very, very thin, and it could be made even thinner depending on the particular circumstance. If, for example, you thought you were enacting God's will, then, for example, as during the First Crusade, you would see an army of saints marching alongside the Crusaders fighting against the Muslims. In that case, there's no barrier at all. I mean, the saints have returned from the dead, from heaven, to fight on behalf of the Crusaders, and this is accounted for in several medieval sources. At other instances, it might be a little bit more inscrutable what God wanted, and so that divide might seem much, much bigger.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you bring up Solus in terms of spoilers, but, in terms of earlier on in the Dragon Age series, we also have Morrigan and her mother, who seem to be also fitting into this world of, one foot in the real world and one foot in the spiritual realm.
Sure.
And, it's interesting to me that the game plays into this idea of, bringing in demons, but in their real world manifestation, they're always dragons. And so I'm wondering, in terms of the medieval mind, what role did dragons play? And did they have this kind of spiritual element? And, did people actually believe that they existed? And if so, where were they located in, I guess, the spiritual hierarchy of the medieval age?
It's kind of hard to say. So you see references, not a ton that I'm aware of, though they are there, to dragons in some medieval sources. But the dragon par excellence, at least in medieval thought, was Satan himself. And that's based upon a reading of certain passages in the Book of Revelation. And so, by and large, not exclusively, it becomes a little bit more problematic later on, but by and large, when you see references to dragons, it's a sign of great evil. And it only appears kind of when something terrible is happening, because the devil is making himself manifest in the world. And again, in that way, the reappearance of a dragon during the Blight, for example, in Dragon Age is kind of mimics that in some ways. Is that it's the devil reappearing in the world to wreak terrible havoc, and the forces of good need to fight against that to try to stop it. In medieval thought, it's not. There's no Grey Wardens who can fight against that dragon. It's really God himself who, after a time of persecution, will stop the the depredations of the rampage of Satan and restore order. But that only occurs really right at the end of time, at the very end.
Sure.
So that dragon, to get back to your question, the dragon kind of loomed in a certain sense in the back of the medieval mind, but it wasn't like to be expected that it could appear. There were certain kind of stories, like the story of St. George and the dragon, for example. St. George slaying the dragon. I mean, that was a common medieval story, but it was set in another time and place. The story of St. George by the Middle Ages was already an old story. It happened a long time ago when there were dragons, but there aren't dragons now.
All right, Matthew, thank you so much for joining the show.
No, it's been my pleasure. So I'm going to go upstairs and maybe play a little Dragon Age right now.
Awesome.